The Newsagents USA.
The truth is they're trying to get out of it because she doesn't want to debate. She's not a good debater. She's not a smart person. She doesn't want to debate.
So they're having a debate right now about the debate. The first time that Trump and Harris will come head to head on September the 10th. And as you heard Trump say there, he thinks he's sticking to the rules. She, however, is trying to change them.
Yeah, because what she wants is for Donald Trump to be heard in the debate saying things like, I don't think she's a very smart woman. I think she's dumb. She's not really black. Well, she's suddenly become black. All those things that have cost Trump, the Democrats want to harness. They want him caught on a hot mic saying what he really thinks. But that raises a question. Is this debate ever going to actually happen, given the two different ways both sides see it? Welcome to the Newsagents USA.
The Newsagents USA with Emily Maitlis and John Sopel.
And Mr. Sopel has been up since 5 o'clock with his grandchildren. So it's going to have a whole new tenor, I think, today's episode, as if we've both just come in from a club.
Honestly, so my son went away for 24 hours and left us in charge of grandchildren. I am exhausted. So, Maitlis, you're going to do all the heavy lifting today. But I think that this debate stuff is fascinating. It's due to take place on September the 10th. And remember, Kamala Harris, since she announced that she was running and has become the nominee, has not done a sit-down interview, has not done a news conference, has not done a town hall, has not been subjected to scrutiny. And so there is a huge amount riding on this particular debate on September the 10th. And first of all, you've got Donald Trump saying, well, I'm not happy about this. I don't see why I should do ABC, the network that's going to do it, because he thinks they're full of people that hate him. And you've got Kamala Harris now saying, well, I'm not going to do it unless we have certain rules about how this is going to unfold.
I think it does expose a tension that both of them feel right now, which is that the stakes have suddenly become incredibly high. And I mean, Trump is right, essentially, to say we agreed the rules. They were going to do the same rules as the one with Biden, which privately he thinks went so well for him, it actually went too well because it finished off Biden. And Kamala Harris is the one, her team is the team saying, actually, we'd love to keep the mics live because we want to trap you into saying all those things that we know you say accidentally out loud. And I can't help feeling it is a bit minxy, actually. It is a bit weird for them to suddenly try and change the rules of the game because it's very obvious what they're trying to do. They kind of want him to fall into this trap. And Trump was asked about it in the sort of almost off-mic comments that you just heard at the beginning, which we can hear in full, where, you know, he's just thrown a question from a reporter and he ends up sort of agreeing with Harris, but then denying it, but then wanting to stick to the rules, but then saying he doesn't really mind. And her team, after that, just go, great, job done. Have a listen to the exchange in full.
Would you want the microphones muted in the debate whenever you're not speaking?
We agreed to the same rules. I don't know. It doesn't matter to me. I'd rather have it probably on, but the agreement was that it would be the same as it was last time. In that case, it was muted. I didn't like it the last time, but it worked out fine. I mean, ask Biden how it worked out. It was fine. And I think it should be the same. We agreed to the same rules. Same rules and same specifications. And I think that's probably what it should be. But they're trying to change it. The truth is they're trying to get out of it because she doesn't want to debate. She's not a good debater. She's not a smart person. She doesn't want to debate.
The interesting thing is that, of course, that the law of politics is, and the law of political debates is, that if you are well ahead in the polls, you don't need the debate. You don't need that attention. Whereas if you're behind, you ask for as many debates as you can possibly have. And you do get a sense that in Trump land, far from what happened when, you know, Trump saw off Biden and in effect ended his campaign because the debate was so awful from Joe Biden, Trump land realizes that the game has shifted and Donald Trump has shifted and that Donald Trump needs these debates. But what you've got now is the Democrats who had originally insisted when Joe Biden, you know, the original Joe Biden-Donald Trump debate was on Joe Biden's terms. It was him who insisted that Donald Trump not interrupt him because they were worried he'd lose his train of thought. And so these are the Biden set of rules. It's just that there's a new sheriff in town and Harris doesn't want those set of rules anymore.
The people around Trump at the moment, Susie Wiles, Chris LaSavita, are trying desperately hard to keep him on message. In other words, stop him saying these weird remarks, off camera that end up with him saying she's not very smart. And so the Harris team think that they can make a little bit of trouble by making Trump somehow object to what his own team are trying to put in place for him by saying, well, I don't mind, I could do it. I'd love the mics live. By doing that, he is almost sort of at odds then with the team that's trying to keep him in check. And I think the Harris team have spotted this opportunity. Let's just make him fall into the trap where he ends up sending his own team packing and they're pulling their hair out.
Yeah, I mean, Donald Trump in the last hour has posted, Kamala Harris was basically a national joke until there was an explosion of media propaganda on her behalf about 35 days ago when the Democrats imposed her on the party and the country without having a single vote. And one of the reasons is because every time she spoke off script as vice president, this is all one sentence, it was a gigantic embarrassment. So you've got Donald Trump there on Truth Social in the last hour. That is exactly what his minders want to avoid. Him getting into personal insults with Kamala Harris. They want him talking about the economy and they want him talking about the border. Those are the two issues where they think they're going to make most progress. And there was an interesting piece of New York Times reporting, which is that Donald Trump so loathes Kamala Harris that he can't help himself, even though he keeps being told, just stick to policy. Don't do the playground insults anymore. And yet you can see this. He can't help himself. And that's why there is a tension between him and his campaign.
I agree. He sort of keeps falling into that trap. But there is a kernel of truth in that she has had the most extraordinary month of positive press. And she still hasn't done a sit-down interview. And she's promised to do one before the end of the month, which is kind of like 3 days now. And
I'm going to correct you. She's promised to schedule one before the end of the month.
Okay. So
when is it going to be scheduled?
Okay, so you have got to think that she probably is a bit nervous about this because she's done it all without ever having to explain lots of policy ideas that have changed, that have morphed, that might prove quite unpopular if she drills down in them. We know she set herself against fracking. We understand that she has kind of acknowledged that fracking will have to go on. Fracking is very popular amongst many conservatives in America, and she probably is shifting on that. She's been very defiant on gun background checks. Again, not popular with conservative America. There'll be swing voters who are watching to see what she actually has to say on some of these issues. And so she must be thinking, right, I could put the debate next, okay, but then what happens? Like, who does she sit down with? Does she do a hardball interview? Does she do a chatty one with a podcast? Does she do something that is going to, put her through her paces? And we don't know what that will look like right now, right?
Well, apparently what you've got at the moment is that every journalist, reporter, interviewer, producer in town writing, saying why you should come on our programme, why you should be on my radio show or my podcast or my TV sofa.
We have suggested the News Agents USA, haven't we?
News Agents USA is the obvious place where we would just give her really gentle questions and say, Kamala, is there anything else you'd like to tell a grateful nation? Funnily enough, I think this is getting serious for her, the lack of it. And I think that her campaign have to judge when this turns and starts being a serious problem. The New York Times today have published 21 questions that they would like to ask Kamala Harris on economic policy, on social policy, fiscal policy. You say you want to do this, you want to kind of cut taxes for the middle classes, but where would you raise taxes? And if it's for those earning over $400,000 a year, does that cover all the things that you are ambitious to do? Because at the moment, the sums don't add up. There are a lot of holes in her policy agenda where you think, well, hang on, that doesn't quite work out. What are you going to say about that? And you just think, when the Labour Party in the UK publishes its manifesto, the degree of scrutiny that it is under, Kamala Harris doesn't seem to want to subject herself until the last possible moment to that scrutiny. And that, I think, is a risk as well.
Yeah, I also think there's been something very curious about this last sort of few years, this particular election cycle, which is because the Senate has been so close between Republicans and Democrats, the vice president has often had to cast the defining vote. You know, it is Kamala Harris as the vice president that ends up deciding some of these knife-edge votes. And so I think about 30 times she's had to cast the vote that decided whether legislation would pass or fail. So it's not like she's sort of above this, you know, as part of the executive that doesn't really get its hands dirty. She has actually put her name, you know, signed her name into these votes. So it's very easy to run down the list and say, you voted yes on that, explain. You voted no on that, explain. And I think this will, you know, in a forensic interview, this will chase her, probably.
Before we leave the subject of the debate, do you reckon it's going to happen?
I think they each want the other to pull it, but they won't be the one that pulls it.
Yeah, good answer. I think that's right. I can't see that it doesn't happen. I think it would just seem like a kind of betrayal of the American people, and there'll be so much blame attaching to the person who pulls the plug on it. One thing I learned about the Biden-Trump debate was that apparently when that happened and CNN covered it, 2 days before, White House staff knew that Biden was not in the best shape, that he was sick, and they wondered about postponing, and they decided that to postpone would be terrible because of the press that they would get. And so they felt they had to go ahead. And then on the day, which of course, huge miscalculation. And then on the day itself, Biden is being shown around the studio where they're going to do this debate by one of the senior, you know, panjandrums of CNN. And this bloke is explaining to the president how the microphone cut button works and how it will process. And Biden is in another world and just suddenly says to the CNN bod, "Would you like a selfie?" And he was just clearly not there. And this person then went into the production gallery and said to the staff, "I don't know whether he's going to last this debate." And that was what happened just before they went live with Joe Biden versus Donald Trump.
Do you know what? It's fascinating that. I mean, it's a kind of whole drama in itself, because there is a duty of responsibility. You know, there is a duty of care, responsibility that journalists have. And I remember, you know, quite often on Newsnight, a guest would turn up drunk, right? It was a late night program, 10:30 at night. And you'd have to make a call on whether to leave yourself with a hole in your running order that might be, you know, 10 minutes long, or to put somebody on air that you knew was drunk. And actually, ethically, we had to say no. You know, we had to pull the plug. Now, obviously, this isn't drunk and it doesn't have a name. And maybe the guy would sort of tell himself, oh, I wasn't sure, maybe I misheard and all the rest of it. But I think there is a kind of question of care, isn't there, that comes into whether you go ahead with something like that.
Oh, I don't know. I think that politics is a game played by consenting adults. And if someone turns up drunk and disorderly, could you ever imagine the circumstances where you say to the President of the United States of America, "I'm sorry, we don't think you're fit to go on air"? Wow, that would be a mighty big call.
Well, particularly if it's CNN saying that to the Democrat president.
Yeah, exactly.
It doesn't work, does it?
It doesn't.
It's a minefield.
It's a minefield. Look, we'll be back after the break with a look at one of the hot button issues of this election, abortion and reproductive rights.
So interestingly enough, Kamala Harris is yet to do her, you know, big sit-down interview, her interrogation, whatever. J.D. Vance, Trump's VP pick, has done a couple of them. And I think I've said this before, he is a better communicator in those adversarial interviews than in most other walks of life that I've heard, actually. You know, certainly he doesn't get led down sort of cat talk as he does on podcasts, and he doesn't sort of leave the crowd flat as he does sometimes in the rallies. When he's up against a one-on-one interviewer, he's quite convincing and he's quite compelling. And he was talking to Kristen Welker on NBC's Meet the Press at the weekend. And most of the discussion was about the economy. And he was trying to insist that these big import tariffs that Donald Trump wants to impose on goods, particularly from China, wouldn't push up prices for consumers. He didn't actually admit that they wouldn't, but he kind of, handled the economy side well. And then suddenly, Kristen Welker asks him this.
Can you commit, Senator, sitting right here with me today, that if you and Donald Trump are elected, that you will not impose a federal ban on abortion?
I can absolutely commit that, Kristen, and Donald Trump has been as clear about that as possible. I think it's important to step back and say, what has Donald Trump actually said on the abortion question, and how is it different from what Kamala Harris and the Democrats have said? Donald Trump wants to end this culture war over this particular topic. If California wants to have a different abortion policy from Ohio, then Ohio has to respect California and California has to respect Ohio. Donald Trump's view is that we want the individual states and their individual cultures and their unique political sensibilities to make these decisions, because we don't want to have a nonstop federal conflict over this issue. The federal government ought to be focused on getting food prices down, getting housing prices down, issues, of course, where Kamala Harris has been a total disaster. So I think Donald Trump...
Yeah, it's a good answer he gives. Of course, the problem is that Donald Trump was taking a victory lap for having overturned Roe versus Wade, which gives, in constitutional terms, a woman's right to have an abortion. So, yeah, he's saying it's up to the individual states to decide. What it's not is up to individual women to decide. And that is kind of the problem that you have with the state of law as it is in the United States at the moment. And you have Donald Trump. And I think there has been a pivot in the way they're trying to communicate this issue, because they know they're being hurt by it. And they know that women in disproportionate numbers go out to vote at elections. And that could cost Donald Trump very dear. With Donald Trump saying, I'm great for women. I'm great for women's reproductive rights. He said that on Truth Social. And I kind of think that that's going to get a bit of a hollow laugh from a lot of women who are now having to travel hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles if they need to get an abortion.
The Democrats have weaponized this whole area to the hilt, because they have basically claimed the rights of women, the rights of women's freedom, the rights of women's health, and thrown it back in Republicans' faces and said, if you want your freedom, then stick with us. The curious thing is that I think Trump has massively mishandled this. And I was kind of led to thinking this by something that J.D. Vance said. And he threw out this line in that same interview. He said, you can have, Democrats would let you have an abortion, right through the whole pregnancy. And I thought, well, that's not right, is it? That's got to be wrong. And then I did some digging around, and it is extraordinary how different the actual term lengths that allow for legal abortions are between the states. So if you look at Vermont, if you look at DC, there is actually no time limit. And if you compare that with many European countries, Europe has got much more restrictive time limits. Most of Europe sort of put a limit at around 12 or 14 weeks. And I think if the Republicans, if Trump, or if the Supreme Court had done something very different at the beginning of this and not made it about, the state's right to choose, but actually said a lot of people with modern medicine feel uncomfortable about these sort of endless term limits, they could have got real traction on a subject that, a lot of Americans probably could be convinced needed to change a bit. And yet they've kind of thrown it all away.
Well, that is what the Chief Justice, John Roberts, originally wanted. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court originally thought, why don't we just say, nothing after 16 weeks and make that the revision to Roe versus Wade. He was overruled by the conservative justices that have come onto the Supreme Court, largely as a result of Donald Trump's period when he was the president of the United States and appointed 3 Supreme Court justices. So that does make sense as a position. The problem with the states' rights argument that J.D. Vance is advancing there, and it's the oldest argument in American politics, what is the right of federal government, what is the right of individual states, is that some of these states have really punitive policies towards. It's not just a question that you can go to Vermont and get an abortion. They are passing laws in some of the kind of, dare I say, redneck states where you will be punished if anyone helps you travel out of state. So if you are poor and you want to you need to borrow $500 from a bank so that you could go and have an abortion, the bank could be held responsible legally for having assisted an illegal killing of a fetus.
And the doctors and the nurses. And it raises questions about, whether abortion drugs, for example, can travel, from one pharmacy to another across a state border. I mean, all these questions are unresolved. But I think the Roberts thing is absolutely key because, if you look at somewhere like Texas makes abortion illegal with all those implications for doctors and nurses and anyone who might assist. It is absolutely illegal. If you go to Utah, which is what we think of as a deep red state, a large Mormon population, and it's called, heavily restrictive on abortion, it actually still allows abortion legally up to 18 weeks. So, the difference in this patchwork across the country, even within sort of red states, themselves, is entirely different, entirely confusing, which is what I think has given Democrats a free hand to say, if you're going to start doing that with Texas, where does it end? It's kind of a trick that they have missed as a Republican. And I think you hear in that line from Donald Trump, or rather see it on his tweets, a certain amount of, regret, right? It's kind of buyer's regret now.
Oh, completely. They are the dog that caught its tail and doesn't know what to do now that it's caught its tail. After I left DC, one of my former colleagues was doing a story about abortion in Texas, and they were going to interview a woman who was now have to travel out of the state to get an abortion. And they were going to pay her a kind of, like we always do, a dislocation allowance because she was having to travel to do the interview. And so you would put her up in a hotel overnight for $150 or whatever it was. And the BBC was told, you absolutely cannot pay her anything because you will be aiding and abetting a crime. And so, you couldn't even pay the expenses for this woman to get on a bus, a Greyhound bus from A to B, because you're doing something that would potentially be illegal. So it just doesn't wash to say, look, what we are trying to do is end the culture wars, which is what J.D. Vance is saying. This is stoking the culture wars on abortion.
Yeah. And I think electorally, as you've hinted, what this all suggests is that Trump has started looking at the women's vote, 53% in the US, looking at young people's votes, young women, young men as well, obviously, who are thinking about their families or their girlfriends or their wives or whatever it is, and starting to think, am I risking losing people that should have been with me on this?
Yeah, I think it's an absolutely critical point. Look, you talked about J.D. Vance, about how he is good in a sort of adversarial interview setting, maybe better there than he is, say, on the stump speech or in other settings. If you just want to go to YouTube and see him in a donut shop last week, it is though he is speaking human as a second language. He's trying to talk to customers there and the people who work there. He asks them the same question every time, and it's like he's not hearing answers at all. It is really very, very uncomfortable.
It's very funny, isn't it, that Tim Walz, who is Kamala Harris's VP, has managed to tarnish him as the Yale guy. And I think that's so interesting because J.D. Vance was, brought on the ticket primarily because he's meant to be the guy from Ohio that had the tough childhood, that wrote about it all in Hillbilly Elegy, that was one of the people. And actually, as soon as Waltz came on the scene, he was like, you want small town? I can do small town. This guy, he went to Yale.
Yeah, do you know what? It's a whole interesting other discussion. I fundamentally disapprove of Walz shaming somebody who's come from a poor background and done really well academically. Because, if you...
That's also right. Yeah, you're right.
It's kind of like, what the hell? You don't believe in social mobility in America?
Yeah.
Come on. The American dream is that by your own endeavours, you can get to the highest places. And in some ways, J.D. Vance has done that. Anyway, we will be back after the break.
I was taking a group of people falconing up in Goshen, New York, up in the Hudson Valley. And I was supposed to meet them there at like maybe 8 or 9. I was driving up maybe, really early, like 7. And that woman in a van in front of me hit a bear and killed it, a young bear. So I pulled over and I picked up the bear and put him in the back of my van because I was going to skin the bear.
We are not going to play you any more of this incredibly long, rambling story.
I want the whole thing. I want the whole thing.
This is what we get paid for, just playing you very, very long anecdotes by The man who admitted to killing a bear cub and leaving it in Central Park over a decade ago after a day out falconing. There are so many twists and turns of that story. You can go and check it out. But anyway, that man was RFK. He was the third guy in the race, the COVID jab denier, the man who thinks that 9/11 had, I think, good people involved in it. I mean, the conspiracy theories go on. Anyway, in the last week, he has dropped out of the race, or at least, as he says, suspended his race in places where it is tight. And he has now offered his support to Trump, who we think has offered him a job in government, in the cabinet, if Trump wins.
And the RFK of whom Emily speaks is Robert F. Kennedy Jr., son of Robert F. Kennedy, who was the Attorney General in the JFK administration, who was going to run for president before he was assassinated. Now, RFK Jr. has been a kind of thorn in the side of American politics in a way, because people can't quite calculate whether he does more harm to Trump or whether he does more harm to Kamala Harris as it is now. But we thought about, was it going to harm Biden as well? He has not been as significant a force as he was when he launched, when he was standing at something like 15% in the polls. He had gone down to 4%. He was becoming a more and more marginal figure. On Thursday in Chicago last week, it was a rather sad sight of seeing a stall near the city's art museum that were just giving away his merch because they realised that the campaign was about to end. So I got a T-shirt, lip gloss, and a badge, which I gave to our cameraman Rory, who was very delighted to have some RFK Jr. merch. And the other thing that RFK is going to do, though, which is kind of interesting, is that he's going to work on the Trump transition team about who are the people that should be appointed and what are the policies that should be adopted by the White House if Donald Trump should win the presidential election. So RFK is going to stand in a few states still, but none of the swing states, and he's urging his supporters to go out and back Donald Trump. Whether they will or not, whether it makes a decisive impact on the campaign, who knows? But he's one more person who is two coupons short of a pop-up toaster leaving the political race.
I have to say, I think given that the Harris campaign has already deemed Trump to be the weird guy, having an even weirder guy who is now part of your team, who's now part of your entourage, one of your surrogates, is kind of a, dare I say, weird thing to do. Either Trump thinks, he brings RFK into the fold and goes, you think I'm weird? Look at this guy, I got nothing. Or else you think that the whole kind of shtick that RFK is running makes Trump look like he's kind of part of the same conspiracy vibe. He thinks everything's about to kill you. He thinks broadband's about to kill you. He thinks chemotril's about to kill you. I mean, maybe he knows something we don't. I don't know. But right now, I think it is dangerous for both of them, frankly, because I think he would have taken votes from Trump. So Kamala Harris may find that those margins really do kind of, bleed into what could be a very, very tiny lead for her. But I think it's also dangerous for Trump because suddenly he's got, this albatross around his neck. Do you have an albatross around your neck? You know what I mean? A millstone, a bird. Anyway.
I think an albatross around your neck would be quite uncomfortable. They're really big birds.
Be lovely.
No, I don't think you wouldn't want an albatross around your neck. You really, really wouldn't.
You'd always have a pet. Somebody to talk to very close.
The other thing that RFK Jr. complained of when he kind of gave this rambling sort of address about why he was supporting Trump was he complained that Kamala Harris wouldn't take his call because he wanted to discuss all this with Kamala Harris. And I think, well played Kamala Harris for not taking the call, because you're putting yourself on the side of kind of normality and normalcy rather than kind of some of the nuttier fringes US politics.
Green ink doesn't cover it, right? If you saw him in a letter form, it would be sprawling green ink that went on for 25 pages. You just wouldn't even touch it.
Would it be sprawling or block capitals? I think it would be block capitals, the whole 25 pages.
I think very loopy, very, very loopy. Anyway, that is pretty much it from us. Before we go, though, we will just tell you about something we're keeping an eye on, which is the politicization of the people who certify elections, who Trump has started calling out by name and calling heroes at his rallies. It is raising eyebrows amongst Democrats who think that he is about to start using them to make sure he cannot lose in states that he needs.
Yeah, I mean, if you think back to the 2020 election and Donald Trump still insisting that the Georgia election was fixed and he really won it, well, you've now got on the Georgia election board a bunch of MAGA supporters who are Trump's place people who are going to apparently deliver. And there's a really interesting school of thought, which is that, you know, even if Donald Trump loses the election this time round, he has put in place the sort of things that weren't in place 4 years ago, which could deliver him victory. And that this is a worked out strategy of how they are going to deliver him victory, whether he has got the votes or not. And that is why we're going to keep a very close eye on this in the weeks and months to come. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye for now.
The Newsagents USA.